Are they yours? The millionaire's question cut through the heavy silence of the room. On the cold floor, Jake Carter merely tightened his arms around his two children, his gaze unwavering. Just moments before, the apartment door had swung open. Jake, a veteran-turned-single father, was huddled on the floor, his back against the wall. Two tiny beings were pressed against his chest, seeking what little warmth he could offer. He was so absorbed in comforting them that he didn't notice someone had entered until a pair of polished leather shoes stopped directly in front of him. When Jake looked up, he saw Richard Hale, the building's owner, standing frozen in the doorway. His expensive suit looked jarringly out of place against the cracked walls. Instinctively, Jake pulled his children closer, his eyes fiercely protective. "Who are you?" Jake's voice was a low growl. Richard stared, stunned by the scene before him. Two newborns wrapped in old blankets, and a man who was clearly at the end of his rope. The eviction notice in his hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy. "I'm here to see the tenant," Richard finally said. Jake shifted slightly, and one of the babies stirred, letting out a sharp cry. "Well, you've found him. What do you want?" Richard opened his mouth to say something harsh, but the words wouldn't come. Something in the soldier's steady, fearless gaze gave him pause. He quietly tucked the notice away. And then he asked a question entirely different from the one he'd come to ask. "Are they yours?" "Yes," Jake answered without hesitation. "And before you start lecturing me about the rent, just know I'm working 3 jobs. Things are just tight this month." Richard's eyes swept over the room again. No toys, no crib, just a few cardboard boxes and the barest of essentials. This wasn't neglect, it was survival. One of the babies started to cough. Without a moment's hesitation, Jake grabbed an old thermos, poured some warm water into a bottle, and tested the temperature on his wrist. His every motion was precise, practiced, and brimming with love. Richard felt something tighten in his chest. "Why are you sleeping on the floor?" Jake's jaw clenched. "Because the sofa's broken, and the floor is warmer for them when I'm holding them. I don't need your pity." The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Richard took a deep breath, then decisively tucked the eviction notice back into his jacket pocket. The gesture spoke volumes. The plan had changed. Jake's eyes narrowed, his posture still defensive. "What do you want?" "I came here to do a landlord's job," Richard said, his voice softening, "but I think I'll be staying for a different reason." Jake didn't trust him. Not yet. Men in expensive suits never did anything without an angle. But instead of pity, there was a strange look of respect in the man's eyes. "I'm sure you've seen worse than this," Jake bit out, trying to snuff out the flicker of hope rising in his chest. Richard shook his head slowly. "Nothing like this. I've never seen a soldier sleeping on the floor to keep his children warm, with a look in his eyes that says he'd take on the world for them." The words struck a chord in Jake's pride. He seemed to stand a little taller. "I don't take handouts. I'm not offering charity," Richard countered instantly, his tone firm. "I'm making a proposition, a job." Jake let out a dry, humorless laugh. "A job? From you?" "You're not a broken man, Carter. You're a soldier," Richard said, and the use of Jake's last name made him freeze. 2 tours, honorable discharge. You don't just know how to survive. You're a protector. The suspicion in Jake's eyes instantly sharpened into the alertness of a man whose perimeter had been breached. "You ran a background check on me." "I'm a businessman," Richard said simply, not flinching from the accusation. "I do my research on potential assets." The twins stirred in his arms. Jake rocked them gently, torn between anger and a desperate curiosity. Finally, he met Richard's gaze. "Get to the point." Richard looked him straight in the eye, his own gaze unwavering. "I need a bodyguard," he said, "for a very important client. The job requires absolute loyalty, discretion, and someone willing to protect at all costs." He paused, his eyes warming as he looked at the children in Jake's arms. "I think that's you." Jake almost laughed. "Why me? All you see is a deadbeat sleeping on the floor." "No," Richard replied immediately, his voice resolute. "I see a father. I see protection in its purest form. That kind of love, that unshakable loyalty. You can't teach that." The words hit Jake square in the chest. A dangerous, fragile hope began to kindle inside him. This could be a way out, but soldiers like him knew that no way out ever came for free. He looked down at the two sleeping faces, feeling the warmth of their breath against his skin. Everything he did for them. "This job, is it dangerous?" Jake asked, his voice rough. "Yes," Richard admitted, "but the rewards match the risk." Jake looked up, the defensiveness in his eyes replaced by the resolve of a soldier before battle. "I'm not afraid of risk," he said. "I'm afraid of not being able to give them a better life." The next morning, Jake felt like an alien standing before the towering skyscraper of glass and steel. His old, threadbare army jacket was a relic from another world, a world of mud and cordite, utterly foreign to this cold, polished glamour. He clutched the carrier, holding his two sleeping children, their small bodies his only anchor in this sea of opulence. Richard was already waiting, and his slight smile eased some of Jake's feeling of being out of place. "You came," he said simply. "I came to listen," Jake replied, keeping his voice neutral. Inside, the silence was overwhelming. The polished marble floors reflected a distorted image of the single father and his two children, a heart-wrenching contrast to the designer-clad figures who glided past them. Every curious glance felt like a needle prick. They entered a private elevator. As the stainless steel doors slid shut, the silence became almost deafening. Richard stopped before a heavy oak door and pushed it open. Jake followed him inside, and his breath caught in his throat. It wasn't because of the massive office overlooking the city. It was because of the woman standing by the window. As she slowly turned around, Jake's world came to a halt. It wasn't a face he could immediately place, but something in her intelligent, sapphire blue eyes snagged on a deep-seated memory. She wore a simple business suit that radiated quiet power, and most importantly, she showed no surprise at the sight of him standing there, two sleeping infants strapped to his chest. "Jake, this is Emily Hale," Richard said, breaking the silence. "Emily, this is Jake Carter." The name Hale clicked into place. This was his daughter, the person he was being hired to protect. Jake only managed a slight nod, still trying to dredge up the memory. Where did this sense of familiarity come from? "Have we met before?" he asked, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. Emily smiled, a soft expression that held a story all its own. She walked toward him, her gaze never leaving the soldier's face. "The last time we met," she began, her voice clear and steady. The air was full of dust and smoke. Gunfire was still echoing in the distance. Her every word was like a key, unlocking a door in Jake's mind that had been sealed shut by the grime of war. "I was a young, foolishly reckless reporter who'd gotten herself into a hot zone for a story," she continued, her eyes seeming to look through him, back into the past. "I was lost, panicked, and I wouldn't have made it out alive." Jake held his breath. The image began to form, fragmented and hazy. A narrow alley, swirling dust. A young woman with dirt-streaked blonde hair, her eyes wide with terror. Then a soldier showed up, Emily said, her voice trembling slightly. "He pulled me out of that alley, gave me his last half of a ration bar, and didn't leave until he knew I'd made it to safety." She paused, looking Jake straight in the eye. "You never told me your name. You just said you were doing your job." Jake stood as still as a statue. The face of the young girl from all those years ago was now merging with the powerful woman in front of him. But he still couldn't place it. Her face was a blur, mixed in with dozens, maybe hundreds of other civilians he and his unit had helped over the years. They were just fleeting shadows in a firestorm. He shook his head slowly, regretfully. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I don't remember." No disappointment crossed Emily's face. Instead, her smile grew more understanding. "I know," she replied, her tone warm. For you, it was just another day on the job. But for me, Jake, it was the day I got to keep living. Her gaze drifted down to the two children sleeping peacefully on his chest, and her eyes softened completely. My father didn't seek you out because he needed a bodyguard, Emily said. He sought you out because I needed that soldier. The one person in this world I know for a fact would never leave me behind. The raw honesty of the moment hung in the air, then dissolved. Emily took a deep breath, and the warmth in her eyes was replaced by a sharp, analytical focus. The smile was still there, but now it belonged to an employer, not a survivor. I am grateful for what you did for me that day, Jake, she said, her tone becoming brisk. But gratitude won't keep me safe. I need to know who the man standing in front of me today is. Richard took a step back, watching in silence. This was Emily's test. Jake nodded, understanding immediately. He unconsciously adjusted the carrier. I understand. Good, Emily said. She moved around her desk and leaned against it. So, let's play out a scenario. This Saturday night, I'm attending a charity gala at the City Museum. Security is tight. Police are everywhere. But we receive credible intelligence. A team is planning to abduct me, not with bombs or a public firefight, but with a sophisticated plan to isolate me from the crowd. She locked eyes with Jake. You're in charge of my security. What's your plan of action? Walk me through it. Jake didn't answer right away. His eyes narrowed slightly, the soldier's brain kicking into gear, processing data, analyzing variables. He was no longer a flustered father, but a tactical specialist. First, he began, his voice low and steady, the smartest move is to cancel the appearance. A known risk is not one you engage with unnecessarily. Your safety is the priority, not the event. Emily raised a subtle eyebrow. Richard gave a nod of approval. It was the first and most important answer. A good bodyguard avoids danger. He doesn't charge into it. Let's assume attendance is mandatory, Emily pressed, upping the stakes. All right, Jake said. Phase 1, prep. First, I need all intel on the threat, numbers, weapons, MO. Simultaneously, I conduct a personal site survey. I want blueprints of the museum, all entry and exit points, including fire escapes, service corridors, and the ventilation system. I'm checking every blind spot, every gap in camera coverage. He continued, his train of thought flowing seamlessly. I'll coordinate with the event security and the police, but I won't be fully dependent on them. My team needs its own private comms channel. We'll have a duress code. If I say, it's a beautiful evening, it means all clear. If I say, I need some fresh air, that's the signal for immediate extraction. Emily listened without interruption. Phase 2. On site, Jake went on, I'm never more than 3 feet from you, but I won't be hovering like a shadow. I'll blend in. My eyes won't be on you, they'll be on the people who are looking at you. I'm watching the catering staff, the tech crew, anyone with a reason to get close. Attackers often hide in plain sight. Phase 3. Execution. Jake's voice hardened. If they make a move, my goal isn't to engage. My goal is to get you out. We'll have at least 3 pre-planned exfil routes. Primary, secondary, and a tertiary route no one would expect. At the first sign of trouble, I create a minor diversion, knock over a tray of glasses, maybe, and use that split second of chaos to move you. He finished, and silence filled the room. He had laid out a detailed, methodical, and practical plan that covered prevention, preparation, and action. He wasn't just thinking with muscle, he was thinking with his mind. A genuine, impressed smile slowly spread across Emily's face. She glanced at her father, who gave a satisfied nod. She turned back to Jake, her eyes now filled with trust. The soldier from that day saved my life once, she said softly, but the man standing before me today, he's the one I need to protect it. Emily's eyes were filled with trust. So, do you accept? Jake glanced down at the 2 sleeping infants on his chest, then at the woman whose life he had once saved. The decision was no longer a burden, but an inevitability. "I'll take the job," he said, his voice firm. That night, Jake stood in the middle of the penthouse, the vast space, with its glass walls overlooking the sparkling city, felt like another universe. But he wasn't distracted by the luxury. To him, a large space just meant more angles, more threats. In the corner of the room, 2 brand new cribs stood ready, and for the first time in months, his twins were sleeping in real beds, not in makeshift blanket-lined cardboard boxes. Emily entered, holding 2 soft, neatly folded baby blankets. She said nothing, simply walking over to the cribs and gently tucking one around each child. It was a simple gesture, one that needed no thanks, but it spoke of a deep understanding. She turned to find Jake checking the lock on the balcony door. He moved like a ghost, silent and efficient. "You don't have to do that," she said quietly. "This building is supposed to be the safest in the city." Jake didn't turn around, his eyes still scanning the view beyond the glass. "Safety is a concept," he replied. "It's not a guarantee. It's something you create, moment to moment." Emily was silent, watching the man who was turning her living space into a fortress. He wasn't just a hired bodyguard, he was a protector. Just then, a sharp beep from the intercom shattered the silence. Jake spun around instantly, his entire body tensed, poised for action. He strode to the control panel and pressed the button. The voice of the building's head of security came through. "Miss Hale, a package was just delivered for you. There's no sender's name." Before Emily could reply, Jake cut in, his voice steel, leaving no room for debate. "Where is it now?" "Down at the front desk, sir." "Here are your orders," Jake commanded. "Nobody touches that package. I'll be down there in 2 minutes. Minutes later, Jake was in the lobby, observing the package, a plain brown cardboard box, sealed with cheap tape. His gut told him it wasn't a bomb, but guts could be wrong. "Get your bomb squad here," he told the security guard, "and keep Miss Hale upstairs." When Jake returned to the penthouse, Emily was pacing, wringing her hands. "It's been handled," Jake said simply. "But from now on, nothing comes through that door without my clearance." Emily let out a breath of relief, but she didn't ask about the package. She was looking at him with a completely different expression. She had seen, via the security feed, how the building's head of security had followed his instructions to the letter. She had seen the absolute professionalism in his every move. "That soldier from all those years ago," she said softly, her voice filled with contemplation. "He's still in there, isn't he?" Jake paused, turning to face her fully. The glass wall behind him reflected the city lights, making his silhouette seem larger than life. "You're not just a bodyguard hired to follow orders," she continued, almost as if speaking to herself. "You're something else." Jake watched her for a long moment. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice low and sincere. "I'm not anyone special, Miss Hale," he said, and for the first time, he didn't try to hide the exhaustion in his eyes. "I'm just a father trying to protect the people I've sworn to protect." He paused, his gaze shifting toward the cribs. "That list includes my children and my former brothers in arms," he said, then turned his eyes back to meet hers. "And now, it includes you." It wasn't a professional commitment, it was an oath. Just then, one of the twins in the crib began to stir and let out a sharp cry, breaking the solemn atmosphere. Instinctively, Jake rushed toward them, but Emily was a step ahead of him. She glided past him and went to the crib. Jake froze, watching her in surprise. He was so used to doing everything on his own. Emily showed no awkwardness. She leaned down and gently lifted the crying baby. Her hands expertly checked the diaper. Then she cradled the infant against her shoulder, rocking him gently and humming a soft lullaby. The crying stopped, replaced by a contented gurgle. Jake stood there, watching in silence. He saw the powerful woman, the millionaire's daughter, comforting his son with a tenderness that couldn't be faked. She didn't say thank you. She didn't have to. With that one small act, She had shown him something more important than gratitude, trust, and understanding. In that moment, they were no longer employer and employee. They were two people, each carrying their own burdens, who had found an unexpected anchor in one another. Their relationship had changed forever. Standing there, amidst the luxury of the penthouse, Jake Carter, for the first time in years, didn't feel like he was fighting a war. He looked out the window, the city lights stretching out like a promise. Just yesterday, he had been huddled on a cold floor, using his own body to warm his children, fighting hunger, poverty, and despair. He had thought his life was nothing but an endless series of battles. Now, his son was being soothed in the arms of the woman he once saved. They weren't a family in the traditional sense, but in that moment, they were a team, each protecting the other in their own way. He realized it wasn't his battlefield bravery that had brought him here. It was the boundless love of a father, a love that had kept him from ever giving up, a love that had made Richard Hale see something worth investing in. That love had given him a job, a home, and more importantly, a second chance he never dared to dream of. The fight for survival was over, and a new life, unexpected, destined, had just begun.